Okay, so what we're going to do in this video is we're going to create an array that actually sustains buttons. It holds buttons, let's put it that way. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's visualize this. So here I'm in PowerPoint. I'm just going to visualize how we're going to do these buttons. All right, so let's say the first thing I obviously know we're going to need is we're going to need an array. So I'm just going to go here and put this here, and this is going to be my array. And in fact, I said I wasn't going to use an array. I'm going to use a list, and that list is going to be buttons. So that's what we're going to be using inside of this list. It's going to be a buttons. So if I'm going to have a list of buttons, I got to be able to add those buttons to the list. So I'm going to have to create my buttons in code before I add them to this list. So I can declare this up here first, and then I'm going to go ahead and create my buttons. So in code, I'm going to create maybe something called new buttons. And because I'm doing them in code and I want to do them all at once, I'm going to set them up with particular names. So each button is going to have, let's say like, I'm going to set up the name property. So the dot name property, and that will be something generic because I'm going to be making a bunch of them, let's say, button. But they all can't have the same name, so I'm going to have to put this in some kind of a loop so that way I can go button 1, 2, 3, 4 in the loop without me actually having to manually do that. So let me go ahead and create a loop. So my loop is going to go through creating the button name, and then this loop will have an index, and the index is going to be I. So I'm going to go to this button, I'm going to say plus I for that index. So now this loop goes one time, and that'll be 0, right? And then the second time, that'll be 1, and then 2, 3. So the name of the button will be button 0, button 1, button 2, and so on and so forth. Depending on how many I add, it will determine the name of the button. So this is an integer, so I'm probably gonna have to convert this to string. Unless you're using Visual Basic, it might do it for you, but never allow it to do it for you. You should always explicitly convert that to a string to make sure you know what you're doing. The second thing each button will have, so here's the idea. All right, when you create a button in code, it's just gonna create like a little spot like that. That's not what we want. We have to determine the size of the button. So let's say I'm gonna make this button 100 by 20. So I'm going to go to the property here again as I'm creating this button in code. I'm going to do the dot width, and that will equal 100, and the height, and that will be something like 25. And then after I'm done adjusting this button, I'm going to go ahead and add it to my array. And let me give this array a name. This array can be called something like my buttons or buttons or whatever. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and add these to this array. So and then I'm going to say my buttons . And this probably shouldn't be called new buttons. It should be called new button, something like that. All right, so, and I can give this a different color just so it makes more sense to you. All right, so now we have that adding to the buttons. Now the next thing we want to be able to do is go ahead and add these buttons to the canvas. So right now, these buttons are simply added to the array. So if you were running Visual Studio, and you ran this, and this was your canvas, there'd be nothing here. It'd just be blank. So what we have to now do is take these buttons and put them onto that canvas, and we're going to do that with another loop. Since we have these buttons inside of this array, we're going to do a loop. It won't have an index. It'll be loop for each item. So item is going to be our variable that we're going to be using inside of that loop. So inside of that loop, we will do something like we're gonna set the location of the button. We're going to move each button over, because let's say if I add the button right off the bat, let's say I go here and I add button, right? If I do that, this button will show up here, right? It's going to show up on the canvas with the right height and everything, and this will be button 1. And then when I do button 2, it's going to add right on top of that. It's going to be right on top of that. And button 3 and button 4, all the buttons are going to just add on top of each other. So what we have to do is move them over per cycle. So every cycle, we want to move it over maybe 100 pixels. So to move over like this and then over like this, okay? So we don't have them stacked on each other. Let me shrink this. Like this. All right, whatever pixels. And that'll be button 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth. So we got to move them over. And in order for us to move them over, we're probably going to need some kind of a variable. So let's move it over with a variable using, first we need the current position. So we say current x, and then we're going to step that by, let's say 2. And instead of saying 2, we'll say step. And we're going to go ahead and take these variables here. Current x. We're going to put those variables at the top. Current x equals, we'll start it off at 0. Keep doing current. There we go. And then we'll do step. Will be a constant, and that will be 2. So for every cycle, current x is going to change. So it starts off at 0. So the first button is going to start off at 2 pixels. And the second button is going to start at, current x is going to be by 100. So we got to add to current x here. So after we move it over the first time in this loop, we got to add to current x, and we're going to say plus equals, let's say 100. So the second time current x comes around, it's going to be 100 times 2. The third time, it's going to be, 200 times 2. So on and so forth. And it's going to move them over for us. And we can change that number. And after we're done with this part, now we can go ahead and add it to the canvas. Okay, so we're going to add the button that's currently here to the canvas. And that's about it. I mean, we could do some other stuff like remove it, but this is actually the core of what we need to do in order to add things to the canvas, add these buttons to the canvas and loop through. So let's go ahead and go through to Visual Studio and look at how we can code this. Let me shut this down. So here I am in WPF. I'm going to go ahead, well, Visual Studio. I'm going to go into the WPF, and I'm going to go here to WPF.NET Framework, and I'm using C#. You can very well use VB. It's all basically going to be the same syntax. Well, not the same syntax. It's going to be the same procedures, I guess. The same pipeline that you would take to make it here would be the same in VB, except using VB code. So here I go to C# and I go next. Name it buttons or whatever you want to do. Create. All right. Now you're going to go ahead and expand this. And I'm going to now go on the code behind, because really I'm not putting anything directly on the canvas here. But the first thing I need to do right now is I need to check, because right here I have this as a grid. And as you can see, there's a grid here. So I'm going to change that to a canvas. And I want to give it a name, so I can actually put the name here, or I can go over here to the properties and just add the name here. And I'm just going to add that to, let me just call that main canvas. All right, so now I can go in the code behind. So over here inside of the solution, I'm going to click on this little arrow under the main window, and click on this one right here and open up the code behind in the main window. I want to go into the main window, but initialize component, I want to go underneath that. Inside of here is where I'm going to put my code, because this right here is what's going to initialize the windows and all the other stuff that WPF needs to run and visualize things. And then we do all our work here. So the first thing I'm going to do, and I don't really think I should type all this up while you're watching. I should type it and then, you know, pause video and let you see it. But I'll start a few and then let you see it because I don't want this video going too long. The first one we obviously need is the list, because we said we're going to use that list, and we're going to make that list of buttons. And that's the main trick right there. I'm sorry, not buttons, button. That's the class. And then we're going to call it my button buttons, because it will be holding buttons, and that will equal a new list of buttons, and we close it. So that's the core of everything you're doing. Now we said we were going to have to maintain the X position, so we're going to make an integer, and we're going to call that current X. We're going to set that to 0 like what we said before. And now we're going to do all the other stuff that we put in our documentation earlier. I'm going to make a constant, and that's going to be a constant int, and it's going to be the step. Remember that? And we said it was going to step by 2 to push it over. And then we're going to say the width and the height. So we're going to make another const because we don't want this changing at all. We're going to say the width of the buttons will be 100. Oops, const int. There we go. And the height. So we're going to say constant height. And if you notice, what I'm doing is all the constants. And this is a way you want to write this. Whenever you're dealing with constants, you want to write all your constants in capital. So any other coder who's looking at this, they can see from a distance that these are constants because they're all capital. And that's, most coders will use that construct. So I'm going to go ahead and make a Boolean, because I was thinking about this. If I wanted to take these things off or put them on, I need to know if the buttons are off the screen or on the screen. I need to know if the buttons are there or they're not there. Because if I wanted to actually show and hide buttons, or not really show and hide, to add them to a list or take them off the list, I need to be able to say, okay, the buttons are on the screen, or the buttons are not on the screen. And so I want to make myself a Boolean that says is buttons on, let's say, screen. That's 100% clear. And first, when we first start off, obviously the buttons are not going to be on the screen. So now it looks like if we need any other variables, we'll go back up here and we'll resolve that. But this is the actually advantage of writing things down first. Really, I'm not even thinking about anything because I already thought about it when we were writing it down in the PowerPoint. So all I got to do is go by the PowerPoint. So here, I'm just going to go ahead and write up the whole buttons thing. Let me pause the video really quick and we'll come right back. So here we have it. We have a for loop, and this for loop creates this index here, I. It really shouldn't be called I. It should be called index. But we'll leave it for I right now. So we'll say index equals 0. Index, or I, is less than 5. So as long as it's less than 5, you can keep on going. And I++, so that's going to give us that loop, right? It's going to start at 0 and end up finishing off having 5 items altogether. So here's where we did all of our setup here. So we created a new button. It's called new BTN, but really I would like that to be called BTN new. All right, so we have this BTN new, and the content of it is going to, which means this is what people are going to see. This is like the label. It's going to be the index turned to a string. So it's just going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. You can add to that if you want. The name of the button, now this is how we access this in code, will be button +1, +2, +3, so on and so forth. We set the height using this constant here, and the width, the width, and then the height using this constant. And then we took that button and we added it to our array here. So now we have an array filled with buttons. So let's look down here. I'm going to put a marker here. And then I am going to run this code hitting F5. The code should stop here because this is where it's going to initialize. So you see where the code stops here, stopped here, and it says that I equals 0 down there. And if you look over here, I equals 0. And down here, this new button equals 0. And right here, the new button's name is 0. So it already went through this loop one time. But this is why I put this breakpoint here, so it can stop after that one time. The width is 100 and the height is 25. And over here, this new button has, my buttons count is 1. There's only one item inside of this list here. If I go up to this list here, you'll see there's one button, one control button in there. Okay. So I'm going to go through this list. I'm going to hit F11. See, yes, restart it because it's going to go through again. And hit F11. Now it's filtering through. As it goes through, I'm on button 1 now, which is button 2. Remember, the array started off at, well, we're not dealing with arrays right now, but this index started off at 0. And now we're at this new button 2. And then if you go down here, you'll see this I is 1, which is 2. And the content is 1. And hit F11. And then down here, you'll see the name would be button 1. So we have button 0 now, and we have button 1. So once I do that again, and it's going to go back up here, if I look over here to this array, you'll see I have button 0 and button 1, and it continues that way, just like what we did in our PowerPoint. We can see how we're getting this array going on. All right, so I'm going to stop that. And I really don't like this way, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to refactor this and put this into a procedure. So I'm going to want this to be called maybe, I'm going to move this breakpoint. I'm going to call this make button. And I'm going to move it out down here. And I want this to be private void. And I'm going to want this stuff here inside of this. And then I can call that inside of my initialized component. That's much cleaner, so I can know what's being run inside of my initialized component, after the initialized component, and inside of my main. So the question is, do we add the buttons to the canvas directly, like right after this, or should we just, I know what we'll do. We'll go to here, and we will make a button that adds a button. So I'm going to go here and drag myself a button over here. And this button will be called make buttons. And I am going to name this button BTN maker. And now after I set up that, I'm going to double click this so that WPF will go ahead and write the code for me back here. So I have BTN maker here. Inside BTN maker, I'm going to go ahead and first check to see, and this is what I did this for. I want to first check to see if there's any buttons on there. And if there aren't any buttons on there, I want to go ahead and make the buttons. So that's going to be inside the if statement. Oops. So it's going to be inside the if statement, and I'm going to say is button screen. Now this says if button screens is true, but I want to know if button screens is not true. So I'm going to put the exclamation mark right there. That reverts it to not true instead of true. Why is there 2 here? This is wrong. There we go. I'm going to change this here. Okay. So now, if it is not on screen, go ahead and make the button. So since I have this array or this list of buttons here, I'm going to now filter through that list. And I'm going to use a special command called for each to cycle through that. And for each item that's in there, in what collection? Well, this collection, the My Buttons collection. So we want to filter through My Buttons collection. And for each item that's in there, we're going to be referring to each item as item here. And so now all we need to do is set the button first to a particular position. So we're going to call this class called canvas. Don't mistake this word canvas for you naming something canvas. Let's say if this was just called canvas, that's not the same thing. This is the class canvas that we're activating here. So we're calling the class canvas, and we're going to call set left. That's like saying set the X position of something. And what that does is, I'm going to put the mouse over here, you'll see it takes the UI element and then it takes a double, like where do you want to set it? Okay, so I'm going to say we're going to take the item. So every time a button comes up in here, we want to take that. And then we're going to take it, we're going to take the step and we're going to multiply that step by the current X. And remember, I don't have to think about this too much because I already did it in the PowerPoint. So really, I know this logic really should work. We'll find out though. And then I'm going to take that X and plus equals 100. And then, like what we said before, I'm going to take the main canvas and I'm going to add it. Oops. That's children.add. And we're going to add that item. All right, so after it filters through this over and over again, we need to now set this to true because we did put buttons on there after we did this. So we're going to set this to true. All right, so before we move on, let's see if this works. Hit start. Make buttons. There we go. We got our buttons. Now let's see if we can remove these buttons. And I'm just gonna make another button here. And I'm gonna rename this to, instead of make buttons, I'm gonna call it just BT and remove. And I'm gonna change the text here to remove. And then because I copied and pasted it, it's still going to be looking to run this code here. Let me give you an example. I'm going to double click this and it's going to send me to the code. But you notice it's sending me to this code because it's still connected to this procedure here. So what I need to do is go click this button, go into the XAML down here and remove that click from there. All right, so now if I double click on it, it's going to make me a whole new one with this name here. So double click on it there. Now it made it with this name here. And if you're having problems double clicking, it's because you have to move it to the edge so that way it doesn't think you're trying to edit the text because it'll go into text edit mode. So now in here, well, basically we're doing almost the same thing as up here, but we're doing a lot less. So first we got to check to see, again, is buttons on screen. If buttons are on screen, which makes this true, we're going to then do for each item inside of my button. So really, we're doing this exact same thing again. And then we're going to say main canvas dot, instead of children add, we're going to say dot remove. And we want to remove the item that we go through from the canvas, right? So we're removing all the children that we set on the canvas, removing everything we set on the canvas, we're removing it. So after I do that, I need to now say that is buttons on screen, and basically no. After we removed it, obviously it's not on screen, and then we want to oops, I don't know what I pushed there, but we want to go here and we want to reset the current X to 0. Because if we were to click this again, we're going to need that current X to be reset. And to me, this looks like it's done. Well, at least it looks like it's done in comparison to what we did on our PowerPoint. Now, if something goes wrong, we'll figure that out once we hit play right now. I'm going to save this and I'm going to run it. All right, so let's make the buttons that we have, 0, 1, 2, 3, and let's remove the buttons. And here's the test. Can we make buttons again? Yes, we can make buttons, 1, 2, 3. and we can remove buttons. So when we remove these buttons, we're removing them from memory. So we're actually more efficient than hiding buttons and showing buttons, that sort of thing, because if you hide and show, it's still in memory and it's still on screen basically. You just can't interact with it or see it, but you're still using up memory. With this, we're taking it inside of a list, we're removing it from the list, and we're actually saving memory. We're more efficient. So hopefully this video was helpful. If you guys have any questions, leave them in the comment section below. Make sure you subscribe, make sure you share, and I'll see you next time.